Joining us live now from New York is Alex Shephard, a reporter for The New Republic. Hello to you, Alex. Let's start with the saga with Attorney-General William Barr and Donald Trump. What do you make of this?
Well, there are a few different ways to interpret it. I think one is that Barr is trying to assert the independence of the Department of Justice in the face of this continued barrage of influence from the president, particularly on Twitter. But I think that there's probably a darker motivation here as well. Barr and the president are still on the same page. They basically have the same goals. Barr is telling Trump with these interviews, look, I've got your back. Don't make it difficult for me by looking like we're doing something improper. I'll do this stuff, but I don't want you tweeting about it because it'll make us both look bad.
So he's gone very public with it, though, hasn't he? Rather than say, just pick up the phone and say, President.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had to do that. I think he had to make some statement because the Department of Justice's reputation was at risk. You had people rightfully calling this out for looking like it was corrupt, and Barr had to come out and make a statement. I think where things get interesting is that Trump has historically not liked these kinds of statements before, particularly from his attorney general. Jeff Sessions made a similar public statement, and look what happened to him. So I think we'll be looking for fallout here, but I think reading between the lines and also talking to people in the know, you get the sense that Barr is really trying to reassure the president and also trying to just get along with the business that they both share.
So what do you think? Should William Barr resign, or do you think, what do you think will happen?
I don't think he has any intention of resigning. I think he hopes the president will get the message. One, that we're on the same page, so don't make this difficult by making it look like there's a conflict of interest. Now, I think, Barr's critics are probably right that this is a troubling development at the Department of Justice. But I think the fissure here is probably overstated unless, of course, it can be made bigger by either more public comments from Barr or the president continuing to tweet as he did this morning.
Alex, what do you make of this so-called drama between the US and the UK and Donald Trump hanging up on Boris Johnson on the phone?
Yeah, so, I mean, this has been brewing for months. The president had taken a very active interest in the UK's 5G network, wanting them to not use Huawei, the Chinese company. And, they had a very loud row. And the president, as he is wont to do, seems to have hung up on Boris Johnson. Johnson then canceled the trip. And I think that, some people were anticipating, the president in particular, that post-Brexit, the sort of special relationship would be stronger than ever. What we're seeing is that pressure, both in terms of trade, but also in terms of the UK's, post-EU decision-making, is also causing rifts that may not have been there if they had not left the EU.
A huge week for the Democrats. We had the first New Hampshire primary, a record turnout, in fact, more than 295,000. It beat the 2008 record. And the front-runner, Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I think it's a little surprising if, people had said this maybe 4 or 5 months ago, particularly right after Bernie had had a heart attack. I think people would be quite shocked, but it's partly because he has such a, loyal base, but it's also partly because the moderate vote is fractured between 3 candidates at the moment, but there'll soon be 5 with Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg entering the race.
He's an interesting character, isn't he, Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, I think he's unlike anyone else in American political history. Some people compare him to Trump. I don't think that that's quite right. But what he is doing is trying to find this sort of atypical path towards the Democratic nomination. And right now, the fact that, that sort of establishment vote is so fractured, that's his best ally going forward. And if you look ahead to the next 2 races, there's no one there that can really challenge him.
2 interesting candidates and a big difference between the two. Elizabeth Warren, she's got that positive approach saying that the Democrats need to band together. In complete contrast, we've seen a pretty full-on tweet this week, one of many, by Michael Bloomberg taking on Trump directly. I mean, all the gloves are off there, aren't they?
Yeah, I think the question of what happens to Bloomberg is probably the most interesting one going forward. I think Democrats in particular have been sort of panicking about his rise. I think as the sort of moderate vote, particularly Joe Biden, has become, I guess, confused. There's no clear frontrunner. Bloomberg's up to about 15% in the polls. He's getting very Trumpian headlines by attacking the president's, intellect and other aspects of his character. And I think, he's hoping to sort of emerge as the establishment favorite, particularly with Biden seemingly in free fall.
It'd be very hard to knock US politics off the headlines where you live. Where does the coronavirus sit in the news cycle for the US right at the moment? Obviously, it's dominating where we live.
I think an interesting thing has happened in the last week. I think before the last few days, you had a lot of people, particularly in the business community, sort of shrug it off. There was a sense that China's GDP was not going to fall that far, that its impact on global trade wasn't going to be that great. It's still only a handful of cases in the United States. I think over the last few days in particular, there's a real sense that this could be a pandemic and that the U.S. needs to be involved, needs to be preparing better for it. But that really has just started over the last few days, and that's partly because we're so fixated on the presidential race.
And what about the latest news about the billions of dollars being taken from the Pentagon to put towards building the wall? What's coming up with that?
I mean, this has been one of the sort of third rail political issues. The president has been looking for money to fund the border wall. The border wall, of course, for most Democrats is the most offensive and egregious of all of his policies. But no one has really been able to turn it into a particularly sharp attack. I think, you could easily see a Democrat arguing that this was hampering our national security, given, the amount of money. But at the moment, I feel like partly because people are so fixated on the primary, and partly because everyone is so exhausted by the constant churn of the Trump presidency, that this hasn't gotten as much attention as it has when he's diverted funds from the Pentagon to the southern border in the past.
Well, anyone in Australia who tries to do a renovation realises that it takes a lot longer to fix your house up than you might expect, and I'm sure that's the same in the US. There just wouldn't be enough time now. Even if he does get re-elected, obviously there are defined limits to a presidency in the US. It'd take too long to get the wall up, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of two things that are happening. One is that this project is too large and too complicated, particularly given just the property rights involved for the president to finish it in that time period. The other, though, is that because this story has been going on for so long, that Democrats have lost sight of it a little bit, I think. The border wall is not necessarily the boogeyman that it was 2 years ago.
And finally, Alex, so we've got to with the caucuses, we've got Nevada, February 22, the 10th Democratic debate in South Carolina. What do we need to be looking out for there?
I think there's a few questions. One is just to look at Bernie Sanders. His support so far is sort of maxed out at around 30%. I think there's a question going forward if he can sort of broaden that base, and if he can, then he'll really look like a formidable candidate. The other is what happens to this sort of quote-unquote moderate vote. You've seen a lot of speed dating among moderates. Pete Buttigieg is around 20%. There's some interest in Amy Klobuchar. Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg are coming into the race. I think it'll be interesting to see if support sort of coalesces around one of those candidates, or if it continues to be as fractured as it's been in the last two races.
Yeah, if you probably framed the market, you'd have to say that Bernie Sanders is probably the popular vote right at the moment, but that can change. It's a long process. If it is Bernie Sanders, can he beat Donald Trump, Alex, do you think?
I mean, if you look at head-to-head polling, he is certainly leading him in a macro sense, right? Given the electoral college system, it'll come down to a couple of states. Sanders has polled well there in the past. But the one question is just what that socialist label means to voters if presented as the defining label of a major party presidential candidate. And we already know how Trump wins. He wins by making his opponent as unpopular as he is. If he can do that with Bernie Sanders, particularly just by lambasting him as a socialist over and over again, then this might be a very close race.
Well, we have months to go, but we appreciate your time and expertise. Alex Shephard, thanks so much. We'll see you again soon on Weekend Edition.